I was asleep at the switch last week and forgot to bring these, but they'll be just as applicable this time.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so far behind, you might not even wanna give me one.
Yeah. Is Judy no, she's got Elizabeth, doesn't she?
Well, I didn't talk to her today, but I think she had planned to bring Liz.
Maybe
there's-
she's coming.
There's somebody.
She's
Maybe
gonna let
she's
Liz call her,
coming, yeah. Cause I know Wanda's
Yep.
not coming. Good.
She lets you know she's here.
Come on in.
One is that she can't remember, she just calls me Santa Claus. But you know, I got that, they got me a post for the 11th, so it'll be next
11, okay,
Thursday.
Thursday. Mhm.
And, I got this friend of mine, I'm not comfortable driving the wrong way. like that.
Right, right.
And Lonnie Humphries,
Uh-huh, yeah,
he took Matt,
yeah.
and I called him, I said, boy, I need a favor.
Hey,
He's one
hey
of-
Elizabeth.
He said,
Hey. He's one of the guardian angels in Richmond County, or Laurel Hill,
Yeah.
Scotland. Uh-huh. Hey, Liz.
he called me.
There you go.
Hey, Liz.
How are you all?
We're good, how are y'all?
Come on.
You
I
gonna come?
like your glasses.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
They're
they're
kinda
pretty,
like yours.
yeah, they are.
Yes,
They are
Let's sit next
pretty.
to Ken. All right, Gabby has it next to Ken.
Judy,
Straight.
there you go.
Thank you.
See you Sunday.
Sure, he can't try to tote that up, wouldn't you? I hate to try to tote that,
Oh,
wouldn't you?
God, yeah.
That's another thing.
Yes, sir. Could you do, not this coming Sunday, but the next Sunday, if I'm not here, it'll be like the, after Veterans Day. Will you be here? No, I do. I do. Yeah, I do. Well, I appreciate it, We're gonna go, we've been trying to remodel at the beach, and our guy, working has finally decided. Put new countertops in the bathroom, and we have furniture coming, so we're gonna try to do it after Veterans Day.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. I wanna open up with, a prayer from the last verse of Psalm 19, which, I'm sure is familiar to some of you. Makes a really good prayer to open any study or end it. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.
Oh, that's what it was.
Yep, All right. So, what you've got is a handout that I meant to give you last week, but I was, I was brain dead. I was asleep at the switch and forgot it, left it over there, over at first. One side, as you can see, is sort of a, looks like it might actually be a model. There have been any number of replicas of the tabernacle that people have built. Just the instructions are there if you want to get, if you want to dig through the numbers, ever how many cubits of this and that, and the materials, it's, you can do it. And I've seen photographs of models, replicas that people have built. And so when you look at this, you see that it really is just a big tent. You've got a tent wall around creating this enclosure, and then near one end of that, another tent that is the sanctuary that houses the holy place and the holy of holies. And in front of that, actually that's called a tent of meeting, and in front of that, you see a bronze altar, and the brass laver. So the bronze altar obviously for burnt offerings, and then it's a basin for water. And if you look on the back side, you see how this would be laid out. The camp for the Israelites was around the perimeter of this, so the tabernacle was in the center of their camp, and then the tribes were camped outside of that. And you can see how they were arranged. And inside the tent of meeting, in the holy place, altar of incense, table of showbread, in the lampstand, and then in the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, you have the Ark of the Covenant. And there is a couple of curiosities that we don't know a good solution for. In the description in Hebrews of the most holy place, it has the lampstand being in the Holy of Holies. And the description of the Old Testament has it in the holy place. In the Old Testament descriptions, the Ark of the Covenant just had the stone tablets for the Ten Commandments, and in the description in Hebrews, the Ark also had Aaron's staff and a jar of manna. So, and since the Ark of the Covenant, it was, who knows where it is. Now there is this little Ethiopian church that claim they have it and won't let anybody in. Who knows? So anyway, that's anytime we're talking about the heavenly tabernacle and the earthly tabernacle, this is what the earthly tabernacle looked like. So we begin with, we pick up in the middle of chapter 9. Look first at, say, 15 through 22. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the violations that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where there is a covenant, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when people are dead, for it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every covenant had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." And in the same way he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with the blood. And almost all things are cleansed with blood according to the law, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. So 15, the first couple of verses there are a little tricky. He is a mediator of a new covenant. So that's not too tough. He's a mediator of a new covenant. Hebrews has already introduced us to the new covenant. referring back to, Jeremiah 31. So the sense of death has taken place for the redemption of the violence that were committed under the first covenant. Those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. So the people who have been called can receive an inheritance. Who are those that have been called? How would you answer? What would you do with that? Who are the people that have been called?
The believers?
Yeah. I think that's the sort of the straightforward way to look at it. Those who have been called to the church, believers. And it refers to an eternal inheritance, and that's the promise of the eternal inheritance. That's eternal life. That's not too bad. And his death redeems them from sins committed under the first covenant. So we've got Hebrews goes back and forth between using Old Covenant, New Covenant, First Covenant, Second Covenant, but it's all we just different ways of saying the same thing. So we have this sacrifice which purifies us from sins committed under the first covenant. And then we get to 16, and the next several verses. For where there's a covenant, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. How many of y'all have your translation says for where there is a will?
Testament.
Okay, you've got testament, and
Mine says when one dies and leaves a will.
yeah,
That's what.
testament or will. There's a. I picked up a different translation than the one I normally use because it used covenant, and the translation I normally use, it said will, and I was having trouble with that, and saw that actually it's the same Hebrew word that gets used other places as covenant. So I use this one so the language is the same. It's the same Hebrew word that is translated elsewhere as covenant. Not certain how much that helps us, but you think of in these places where it says a will or testament, think covenant. Now, to begin with, covenants in the Old Testament. Covenants were never simply, they weren't ever simply like a document that you signed. Okay, like you go to a lawyer's office and you sign some forms in triplicate. It's never, they weren't a handshake deal. It wasn't anything you signed. Covenants in the Old Testament they nearly always included a sacrifice of some sort, and in fact, literally covenants in the Old Testament were cut. The Hebrew word that is always used to refer to making a covenant literally means to cut. So it's almost implied in the language that when you're making a covenant, there's blood involved. If you look, and the first covenant, it's initiated with the blood of a bull. If you look back at Exodus 24. Then Moses came and reported to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he got up early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 memorial stones for the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men to the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as peace offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it as the people listened. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, we will be obedient. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So when Moses introduces the covenant to the people, it's with the sacrifice of a bull. And anytime that there was if you had a covenant with conditions, where there were terms and conditions, the one who made a covenant like that normally in one way or another invoked a curse on himself if I don't live up to my end of it. So if we look at, I've referred to this before, we look at Genesis 15 and Jeremiah 34. I love this passage in Genesis 15. This is God's covenant with Abram. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Then he believed in the Lord, and he in this case is God, credited to him as righteousness. That's something that Paul picks up on in Romans, that Abraham believed, Abraham had faith, and was credited to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. But he said, Lord God, how may I know that I shall possess it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not them, that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the wrongdoing of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now it came about when the sun had set, that it was very dark, and behold, a smoking oven and a flaming torch appeared, which passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river to the river Euphrates. So we've got Abraham cuts these animals in half, and this fire pot or torch passes between the pieces of meat. And in Jeremiah 34, can't remember what verse that is.
Jeremiah what?
34. Okay. Why did I not write that verse down? Okay. There, I found it. Let's see, I'm gonna start reading, say about, say about 15. Although recently you have turned and done what is right in my sight, each one proclaiming release to his neighbor, and you had made a covenant before me in the house which is called by my name. Yet you turned and profaned my name, and each person took back his male servant, and each his female servant, whom you had set free according to their desire, and you brought them into subjection to be your male and female servants. Therefore this is what the Lord says, you have not obeyed me in proclaiming release, each one to his brother and each to his neighbor. Behold, I am proclaiming a release to you, declares the Lord, to the sword, to the plague, and to the famine, and I will make you a terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. I will give the people who have violated my covenant, who have not fulfilled the words of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between its parts. The officials of Judah and the officials of Jerusalem, the high officials and the priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the parts of the calf. So what we see there is that it was apparently the practice. If you're going into a solemn covenant, you make a sacrifice and you cut the animals in half and you pass between them. So in essence, bringing down a curse on yourself. If I don't live up to it, may I be cut in half like this offering was. And so God makes this covenant with Abram way back when, and passes back and forth between the pieces of meat, just as we saw in Jeremiah 34. So the Jeremiah 34 is simply the explanation of what the Lord is doing back in Genesis. A covenant really wasn't considered to be valid and enforced until there had been bloodshed. So it's like you work out so if you got a contract, so okay, you're going to buy a car, and you're haggling, and you reach a price that you think is good. Alrighty, I'll do it. But it's not there until each of you sign the agreement to buy. And at that point, it's done. But until then, it's simply a verbal agreement. So with these covenants back then, it's not really valid until there's been bloodshed. And the shedding of blood actually makes it valid. Hence that's the verbal terminology to cut a covenant rather than to make it. And
I'm hoping they're talking about the sacrifices, not your blood.
yeah, yeah.
Well, let me ask you, when they had like proof of blood that somebody died,
Mhm.
did they actually drain the blood out of the body back then? Or they had to prove somehow that he was dead and they had to use the blood, so
Oh, I don't know.
I just wondered if they did something like, we would do today.
I okay, well, like in Genesis, when the brothers, they sold Joseph into slavery, and they smeared his coat with a goat's blood, I think, and they used that to show Jacob, here's, that, okay, Joseph has been killed by a lion, here's his blood. So, I guess that they needed to show that something had been done, crime had been committed, they showed blood. Whether they intentionally drained it out of the body, I don't know, I rather doubt that.
Doubt that, but I was just wondering, in a different situation, like when somebody just died.
Yeah,
Maybe they just took some blood, a little bit of blood out of them.
well, I couldn't tell you that.
Yeah. Just thought, did they drain the blood out of them, or just cut a little place and got there?
I thought that's what you Methodists do anyway.
Not quite that bad, we have no snakes, but that's about all.
And so what we see is that, in the Old Covenant, the first covenant, there was, for a covenant to be valid and enforced, there was blood that was shed. And that's what takes place with the new covenant. And behold, I'm making a new covenant with you. And Jesus tells his disciples at the Last Supper, this is my blood of the new covenant. So we can move on to let's see, so to return back to Hebrews, where there's a covenant, there must necessity be the death of the one who made it. Covenant is valid only when people are dead, for it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the only way, okay, I'm making a covenant, now I'm killing myself, but rather, you make the covenant, there's a sacrifice that is offered, and that in that sacrifice, you are calling out a curse on yourself if you don't live up to it. That's sort of the way, that's the way we picture this. And if your translation uses the term will, a will is, the will, it doesn't work until you're dead. You don't get an inheritance until you're dead.
Unless you were the prodigal son.
Yeah, that's right. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with the water and the scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you. And in the same way he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with the blood. And almost all things are cleansed with blood, according to the law. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Couple of things here. And almost all things are cleansed with blood. There were grain offerings. There were some offerings in their sacrificial system that were grain. So not everything was specifically a blood sacrifice, but most of it was. And then he follows that right up, and this is a quote from Leviticus 17:11, and that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin, which is why you have all of those sacrifices under the Old Covenant. let's look at Leviticus 17. And when you're getting into Hebrews, you spend half your time in the Old Testament. I guess the writer of Hebrews was living in the Old Testament. Okay, 17:11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. There's this notion that the blood of any animal belonged to God, because the life is in the blood, and that's why you don't drink blood. That's a serious taboo. You don't do it. So life is in blood, and blood is serious business. And it is in the shedding of blood that there's atonement, and that refers to cleansing for your soul. And in this case, when we think of soul, we tend to think of something different than the Hebrew mind did. Well, so how do we think of a soul? You think of your soul.
The spirit.
Yeah. We think your soul, your spirit, and the Hebrew, their mind is different on this. The Hebrew word for that gets translated as soul is nephesh, and nephesh is, you might think of it more appropriately as your life. It's all of you. It's not just your spirit, like your disembodied spirit, as we sometimes think of, but your soul in the Hebrew sense, your nephesh, is your life. It's your life. It's all of you. It's your passions and your will and your emotions, your intellect. It's all of you. So think life in that case. The Hebrew and Christianity sort of came out of that same mindset. Didn't have this notion of, okay, I've got a body and a soul, and they're totally different things. That's Greek philosophy. That's not the way the Hebrews thought. Your nephesh it's like your life force. So it's not flesh and blood. It's not a spirit. It's who you are, the essence of who you are. On all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and how we love God. So it's your nephesh. It's who you are. So it's not simply a spirit. That's Greek philosophy sometimes messes up the way we read things. Therefore, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Therefore, it is necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these things, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made by hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often, as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been revealed to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is destined for people to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. So we can unpack that just a bit. So this takes us back to the descriptions of the tabernacle at the beginning of chapter 9. Okay, beginning of chapter 9, the first several verses are describing the tabernacle, right?
Yep.
And so this takes us back there, and it describes, in this case, the tabernacle as being sort of it's a copy. It's a copy. So you have, okay, I think the analogy I used is like God somehow gives Moses a vision. Okay, Moses, here's a vision of the heavenly tabernacle. Go make one for yourself. And then gave him the dimensions. And how that work, we don't know. It'd be really fascinating to know exactly how God spoke to some of these people. But you get this, it's presented here that, okay, there's the original. Now Moses, go make yourself a replica.
The screen's not showing right now.
What's that?
The screen is not showing.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. It's doing that little thing that it does.
okay. I think that means that my phone's gonna die. I'm at 20% and little charger's not charging. Oh well.
Can I ask you this since
Yeah.
you're kind of right here? These are the 12 tribes of Israel. Which one is Moses and Aaron's tribe?
They were Levites.
But I don't see Levites in one of these
Oh,
12.
okay.
All we see is Moses and Aaron
Yeah.
and sons.
Okay, the Levites didn't have, the Levites didn't have an inheritance in land. So, and when we look at this, you will see, let's see. Ephraim and Manasseh, they are sons of Joseph. Joseph, you don't see a tribe of Joseph listed there. So normally in the Old Testament, in divvying out like land, the Levites don't count because they don't have a land inheritance. They're the priests. And so you subtract that one, and Joseph, there's not a tribe of Joseph, and so his two sons are each a tribe. So that's how you get to the number of 12. Jesus goes into the heavenly tabernacle, and in verse 24, he did not enter a holy place made by hands, but a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Normally in Hebrews, heaven, the word heaven shows up several times in Hebrews, and and it's not a ton, but like 5 or 6 times. Normally it's plural heavens. In this case, it's singular, and you get the notion that in this case, in 24, he's going right into the presence of God. That Jesus going into the presence of God. Now to appear in the presence of God for us. Or was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that's not his own. There is something that is curious with this, and I don't know whether you'd have picked up on it. Maybe you did. Therefore, it's going back to 23. It was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these things, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So you can, depending on the way you read it, you can read it that Christ and his sacrifice is purifying things in heaven, and that's a tough one. And there's not a real scholarly consensus on that. The two sources that I use disagree on that. One of them says that they shows that the stain of sin is so great that it even reached heaven, and that Christ purified that in heaven. And the other main source that I said that if you do that, you're pushing this way too far. So my leaning is not to press the analogy that far, but that's a tough one, and it's one that's easy to read over.
Mine says, this purification of the heavenly things can best be understood as referring to Christ's spiritual work for us in heaven.
What was that?
Verse 23.
Okay.
Which would tend to indicate that that is very tricky how we handle that. It is tricky.
And then it referred it back to 8:5.
Mm-hmm.
It says they serve in a system of worship that is only a copy, a shadow of this
Mhm.
real one in heaven.
Yeah.
For when Moses was getting ready to build the tabernacle, God gave him the warning, be sure that you make everything according to the pattern I've shown you on the mountain.
So he appears once and for all. So Jesus appears once with his own blood, rather than the priest did. Like every day, the priests were in the holy place, and the high priest once a year into the Holy of Holies. That's a repeated thing. It's just as regular as clockwork. Year and day after day, year after year, you do the same thing. It's what you do. And I'm certain that if you're living in it, then there's power in that repetition. Jesus does it once. And in that repetition, sort of implied in that repetition, is the very fact that you've got to do it over and over and over again means that it's not lasting, right?
Yeah.
So Jesus goes with his own blood once, spotless sacrifice. What? And he's appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Once for all at the end of the ages. So don't think end of the ages. We think end of the ages, okay, that's the end. But you could look at it a couple of different ways, though. Old Testament, the prophets always talked about the day of the Lord. And in the New Testament, they sort of reinterpreted that in terms of Jesus. And so they create on maybe almost a two-tier day of the Lord. In one sense, the day of the Lord is Jesus' incarnation, his coming. And in another sense, the day of the Lord is Jesus' return. So we could look at it that way. We could also look at it that the end of the ages, that the culmination of the plan of salvation is at the cross. That there, the cross is the culmination of the plan of salvation. That's where everything is finished. And Jesus himself said on the cross, it is finished. That's it. No more sacrifices. And just as it is destined for people to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having appeared once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. And this takes us to what you might call eschatology, the study of last things. The idea of death and judgment they're as old as preaching. That goes back way back to the synagogue. There's death, and after death there's judgment. We're all going to die. We're all going to die at some point, and we're all going to meet God. That's a given. And for us as Christians, and this takes us a little, just a tiny bit beyond Hebrews, but the writer of Hebrews wouldn't disagree with it. As believers, our judgment is sort of already covered, because is over and over again here, we're told that we've got this sacrifice that purifies us from sin. So in any judgment that comes when we face God at the end, it's not going to be for sins, because if we're in Christ, then that sins are covered. They're atoned for.
Past, present, and future.
Yeah, exactly. All of them. And then Jesus is returning, and the second time it's not to bear sin, but to bring salvation. And this takes us to Revelation, the end of Revelation, 19, 20, 21. I had to go on into chapter 10. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the form of those things itself, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offered continually every year, make those who approach perfect. Otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have the consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, "You've not desired sacrifice and offering, but you have prepared a body for me. You have not taken pleasure in whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin." Then I said, "Behold, I have come. It is written of me in the scroll of the book, to do your will, O God." The law is only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the form of those things itself. And can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually every year, make those who approach perfect. That's what we were getting at before. You do the same thing over and over again means that it's not, that none of those things are permanent and lasting. The law's it's only a copy. It's a shadow. And I think really this probably applies. This is another way of looking at the law and the tabernacle. Earlier, the law of the tabernacle it's a copy. Okay, it's a replica, and in this case, it's a shadow. And this does get us in the realm of Greek philosophy. Plato had this idea. Plato is several hundred years before Jesus. Plato's not Christian, and there's not a lot in Plato's thought that would be definitely contrary to Christ. But the writer here apparently is borrowing a little bit of Plato's terminology. He told this parable of a cave. So and it's in essence this, that most of humanity, we don't really see the true things that are taking place. We don't see the true form of things. We just see shadows of them. And so he said that most of humanity is like prisoners who are chained in a cave, and they can only see the back wall of the cave. And behind them, there's a huge bonfire, and there are people walking back and forth, and animals walking back and forth in front of that fire, so that the prisoners looking at the back wall of the cave see shadows. They see shadows, and they think that those shadows are the real thing because they've never seen the real thing. But they're still just shadows. And so apparently the writer of Hebrews is trying to borrow a little bit. So in this case, the law of the tabernacle it's a shadow of the real thing. Another way of saying, another analogy, replica, the original and the replica, the real true form of a tabernacle of the law plus a shadow of it. Different ways of saying, of trying to represent it. And only a shadow of the good things to come. That's good things to come. That to come doesn't mean in reference to believers, but in reference to the law. So, where does Christ's ministry begin? We read through that. Christ's ministry begins on the cross. His ministry begins on earth. It begins on earth and culminating at the cross. And it continues in heaven. Christ's ministry does not begin in heaven. You can't separate what he does in the heavenly tabernacle from the cross. You can't do that because that makes all of our faith entirely spiritual and ethereal. But it begins on earth, dusty roads and dirty people and a rugged cross. It begins here and it culminates on the cross, and it continues in the heavens. It doesn't begin in the heavens. That if you go saying it begins in the heavens, and that can lead us into Gnosticism and all sorts of heresies, but it begins here. The sacrifice is on earth. The ministry of Jesus is on earth, and at the end, if you look at the end of Revelation, it's the new earth. It's culminated here. It's not way out in the ether somewhere. It's here. In verses 5 through 10 are a quote from Psalm 46 through 8. You have not desired sacrifice and offering, but you have prepared a body for me. You have not taken pleasure in whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin. Then I said, behold, I have come. It is written of me in the scroll of the book to do your will, O God. After saying above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and offerings for sin you have not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all time. the curious thing here, that the rider is essentially a